Good morning, ladies. Today is March the 23rd, um, a Monday, and we're going to continue our lesson following the Jim Crow era. Yesterday, we discussed this era, which took place in the late 18 hundreds, all the way to the mid 1950s and 60s. And it's basically the term is derogatory. It was used to describe laws and customs aimed at segregating African Americans and other groups. Um, Furthermore, these laws were intended to restrict social contact between whites and other groups, limiting freedom and opportunity. Okay, so once the civil rights took place in 1964, all of this stopped. This was banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, things of that nature. And I also showed you a video yesterday describing what the Jim Crow era was like for people back in this time period. So today we're going to start a new story, and I want you to take a look at your PowerPoint, the essential questions, and I want you to think of these two things. One, can a person of one racial or ethnic group ever truly experience what it feels like to be a person of another group? So let's say, for example, most of us here are minorities. How does it feel to be in someone else's shoes? Can you actually empathize with them? Okay. And what role does this personal perspective play in public? Because imagine when you looked at the film yesterday, yes, this was aimed more at Negro people during the 50s and 60s, but also Spanish people were targets, Jews were targets, Asians were targets. So everybody had some type of fight during this time period. Everybody was affected, and that's the key. So the next story that we're going to read is called Traveling from Just As I Thought by Grace Paley. It's on page 334. If you have your books, please turn here. And I'm going to read a little bit about the author before we start. Okay. Grace Paley was born in 1922 and she died in 2007. She grew up in New York, the daughter of the Russian Jewish immigrants. Before writing as a career, she spent many hours in parks with her children, getting to know the woman and women who would eventually and the peace movement. Okay, so this is one of the stories that she wrote, and she's basically empathizing with another group. So let's start here on page 335, the background of the story. Some of the most visible Jim Crow laws, in parentheses here, we have state laws establishing segregation between African Americans and white citizens, were those affecting public transportation. During the Civil Rights era, laws requiring African American travelers to sit in the back of the bus became the focus of the organized protest. Okay, and now we're going to begin our story. Part one. My mother and sister were traveling south. The year was 1927. They had begun their journey in New York. They were going to visit my brother, who was studying in the South Medical College of Virginia. Their bus was an express that had stopped only in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and now Washington. Here, the darker people who had gotten on in Philadelphia or New York rose from their seats, put their bags and boxes together, and moved to the back of the bus. People who boarded in Washington knew where to seat themselves. My mother had heard that something like this would happen. My sister had heard of it too. They had not lived in it. This reorganization of passengers by color happened in silence. My mother and sister remained in their seats, which were about three-quarters of the way back. Now, in part one, I want to discuss with you, you could see here in the middle where she describes these people. She says, here, the darker people who had gotten on in Philadelphia or New York rose from their seats and put their bags and boxes together and moved to the back of the bus. So, this was like an indirect way of saying, you guys know where you're supposed to sit, get up and move. And here, this was bothering her. Like, why are these people moving because of the color of their skin? Saw him coming. She pinched my mother. Ma, look. Of course, my mother saw him too. What frightened my sister was the quietness. The white people in front and the black people in the back, silent. The driver sighed and said, "You can't sit here, ma'am. It's for them," waving over his shoulder at the Negroes, among whom they were now sitting. "Move, please." My mother said, "No." He said, "You don't understand, ma'am. It's against the law. You have to move to the front." My mother said, "No." When I first tried to write this scene, I imagined my mother saying, "That's all right, mister. We're comfortable. I can't change my seat every minute." I read this invention to my sister. She said it was nothing like that. My mother did not try to be friendly or pretend innocence. While my sister trembled in the silence, my mother said, for the third time, quietly, "No." Somehow, finally, they were in Richmond. There was my brother in school. You know what Mama did? Now, ladies, sit here. Let's take a look at this part here from part 2 to part 8. Notice how many times this woman, who is a minority, by the way, she keeps telling the white man no, sort of rebellious, right? I don't want to move. And so he tries to explain to her, this is the way it is. It's the law. So in the back of her mind, this is not what? Oh, she wouldn't move. He had a classmate, a Jewish boy like himself, but from Virginia, who had a public confrontation with a Negro man. He had punched that man hard, knocked him down. My brother couldn't believe it. He was stunned. He couldn't imagine a Jewish boy wanting to knock anyone down. He had never wanted to, but he thought, looking back, that he had been set down to work and study in a nearly foreign place, and he had to get used to it. Then he told me about the Second World War, when the disgrace of black soldiers being forced to sit behind white German POWs shook him, shamed him. Now, ladies, we're going to stop here for today. Basically, I just want you to think about the essential questions as we continue to discuss. Back in your slides here, it says, can a person of one racial or ethnic group ever truly experience what it feels like to be a person of another group? So basically, you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Can a person actually empathize with another person? And we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Thank you, ladies. This concludes our lesson for today.